In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why thrusting swords are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 9th video in a series where we go through all the weapons in a given weapon class and sort of break down their strengths and weaknesses and show you why or why not you might want to use them in your build. However, before I get into each weapon specifically themselves, I want to talk about thrusting swords in general, the styles of play available to them, and the strengths and weaknesses of this class as a whole. Many of you have probably caught on by now the satire of the title of these videos. Obviously, every weapon type cannot be the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is obviously completely satire based on the amount of clickbait videos out there on the internet. However, I actually think thrusting swords might be the best weapon in Elden Ring based on the factors I'm about to go through. First up, let's talk about how fast the attack speed of this weapon is. It's extremely fast, and it's probably one of the only weapon types in the game that can actually get an attack off when you see an enemy wind up an attack. A lot of very fast attacking enemies with regular straight swords or regular, fast attacking weapons are hard to counter attack them or attack them when you see this wind up. You almost always get hit if you try and trade, but this is a one weapon class that can usually get an attack off before the enemy, a lot of times interrupting them depending on if they have poise or not. Thrusting swords themselves have very decent range, particularly some of the longer ones, and the weapon itself, when you press R1, tends to pull you forward, and even the running attacks tend to pull you more forward than the weapon you would think they would pull you. So you have very good range with this weapon for the size of it as well, allowing you to hit enemies that are relatively far away if you're using the longer versions of this weapon. This weapon type also has something called feints, where if you're charging up a fully charged R2 attack in order to pull it off, but you realize you're going to get hit mid-animation, you can hit the dodge button and your character will complete the R2 and jump backwards out of harm's way. And this is a really good way to protect yourself and makes the sort of duelist style play that the thrusting sword is known for, where you're sort of jumping in and out of combat and dodging attacks without having to block. Another interesting thing about this weapon type is the fact that you can attack while you're blocking, much like spears. So if you're holding up your shield and you press R1, you'll actually block the incoming attack while you poke with the weapon. This typically does less damage than a regular attack. However, it keeps you safe. And if you have something like Barricade Shield up and you don't take any stamina damage depending on the shield that you're using, then you can attack and block at the same time without draining any extra stamina. Another thing about this class is that they can parry. Thrusting swords can actually parry. This allows you to use a shield, put parry on your thrusting sword, allow you to block, do block counters, and parry all with one setup. So this is pretty cool about this class. Or you can use the weapon to parry itself. It doesn't have the best parry in the game, so I don't recommend using it, but it is there if you want it. Another great thing about this weapon class is that the Spear Talisman benefits this weapon class, because the Spear Talisman increases the damage you do with thrusting attacks against an enemy that is attacking you. So if an enemy is in their forward motion of attacking and you hit them, like if you're blocking or you poke them, or you're just poking away at them and they're trying to swing at you, you do more damage, and this will increase the damage that you do with thrusting weapons. Something particularly interesting about dual wielding with this weapon is that the right hand, when you're pressing L1, the second L1 press of the combo will actually hit 3 times rapidly. This means if you have a status effect that you want to apply frequently, like bleeding, for instance, because you can apply this multiple times, you're better off putting that in your right hand, and something that you can only apply once, like frostbite or poison, in your left hand, so that you can keep applying that bleed more regularly and you don't, try and over-apply frostbite and, something like poison as much. And another interesting thing is that if you do a jump attack with L1, it does 3 hits, and the follow-up L1 picks up in the middle of the combo. So if you jump attack with L1, you get those 3 hits rapidly, and then you poke 3 times with the right hand. So that's interesting, and you can use that to your advantage, knowing that that's going to happen when figuring out how to play this build or how to play with this weapon type. This weapon class also is extremely lightweight, meaning that it fits very well into a light equip load sort of build, and it's also a good weapon type if you're trying to make good use of the blue Dancer charm. The cons are that it has relatively low attack damage, and some of the shorter reach rapiers have extremely short reach, so those can be hard to hit with, and also that it does primarily, almost exclusively, thrusting damage or piercing damage. So enemies that are resistant to pierce damage you might struggle with unless you have some sort of elemental infusion or some sort of status effect that can help you get around that. Because this weapon has so much versatility, there are really almost limitless styles of play with it. You can use a shield with it and hold block and poke through that shield if you want, kind of like a hoplite build, but with a rapier or something like that instead of a spear. You can do a parry build and use either the rapier or the Rogier's rapier, which both have very good critical attack damage in order to do high critical attacks. You can use them to do repeated thrusts to hit status effects, and dual wielding is also extremely effective. And we've shown in our Magus build that using magic with A Rapier is also really good, using something like Glint Blade Phalanx to stagger enemies and then critically strike them with Rapier or Rogier's Rapier works very, very well. So there are almost limitless ways you can use this weapon, which is another reason I might actually think it is the best weapon type in Elden Ring. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the thrusting swords themselves. There is only one unique thrusting sword in Elden Ring, and that is the Frozen Needle. Frozen Needle has a unique R2 that fires the tip of the needle into enemies, going further and dealing more damage if fully charged, and deals exclusively physical damage. It's the lightest thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 2.5, tied with the Rapier, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. Although the Frozen Needle has low attack rating and very short reach, it's surprisingly versatile. It takes advantage of the thrusting sword's ability to feint perhaps better than any other thrusting sword because of the range the needle can fly, though charged R2 needles are not boosted by the Axe Talisman. This allows it to hit many enemies safely out of harm's way and use a feint should they close the distance before a full charge is performed. Impaling Thrust is also excellent at dealing damage to enemies with shields, which is a major weakness of this weapon class. The Frostbite buildup is a nice addition that can accumulate rather quickly, though it only plays a part in more difficult battles since most enemies will die before it ever triggers anyway. One particularly good way to trigger Frostbite is by dual-wielding thrusting swords with the Frozen Needle in the right hand. The second L2 press only hits with this weapon, making you build up Frostbite much more quickly, especially if the left-hand weapon isn't of Cold Infusion. If you use a Fire or Flame Infusion on the left-hand weapon or simply buff it with Fire, you can set this status effect over and over, which is great. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 dexterity, from which point it starts dropping off, but is still okay through 80 dexterity. Though the weapon has strength scaling, it is very poor, which makes this a much better first playthrough weapon, particularly because you find this weapon so early in King's Realm Ruins, which isn't too far into the game. Once you've reached 80 dexterity around the end of your first playthrough, you won't be able to get much more damage out of the weapon. I'd either dual wield this weapon with another Rapier for fast attacks using talismans like Winged Sword Insignia, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, or Millicent's Prothesis, or use it with a parrying shield of some sort, mixing up R2 attacks and parries for a more dynamic style of play. One particular interesting thing I want to mention about the R2 attack of this weapon as well before I get on to the next weapon is that it doesn't seem to make very much noise. So if you're going for some sort of stealth build where you're killing enemies at mid-range with that Frozen Needle, you can actually pick them off one by one without ever being detected. This brings us to the non-unique thrusting swords, and first up is the Rapier. The Rapier shares the default moveset of most thrusting swords and deals physical damage. It's the lightest thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 2.5, tied with the Frozen Needle, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Rapier is pretty unremarkable in nearly every way save one, and that is that it's tied for the second highest critical rating of any weapon in the game at 130, outclassed only by the Misery Cord, which is a dagger class weapon. This makes it particularly good for parries, backstabs, and on any enemy that has been stance broken. Make sure to use the Dagger Talisman to further boost critical damage when using this weapon. The Rapier otherwise has the second lowest attack rating of all thrusting weapons and has the shortest reach, making it a poor choice for just about any other sort of duelist build that focuses on rapid piercing attacks. Fire and Lightning are not too far behind other thrusting swords though, neither is Magic, making them decent choices if you plan to make a critical attack style build. The Rapier is also extremely lightweight, which makes it a good candidate for some sort of build that uses the Blue Dancer Charm to increase attack power. If you like the thrusting sword type weapon but you don't really do many critical attacks, then you're better off selecting a different one. Next up we have the Estoc. The Estoc shares an R2 with a Noble Estoc that does a slash instead of a thrust and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 4.5 and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Estoc is a solid thrusting sword in Elden Ring, pulling up second in the attack rating department by a small amount, being nearly tied for second longest thrusting sword, and having an R2 that doesn't deal piercing damage, giving you a viable alternative against enemies that resist this damage type. Plus, you can get two in a single playthrough rather easily. It does have the heaviest weight though, but not by a lot. The Estoc does less damage on average with critical attacks when compared to the Rapier, Rogier's Rapier, or the Cleanrot Knight's Sword, so it's better suited for a build that relies on repeated strikes than outright critical attacks. Because thrusting swords attack so quickly, consider using cold, blood, or poison versions of this weapon to set these status effects fast. Dual wielding these is also extremely effective. Just remember that the right-hand weapon will hit more than the left hand when dual wielding thrusting swords, so it's better for bleed that can be triggered more than once, or frostbite if the left-hand weapon does fire damage, since you can set it again and again. Next is the Noble's Estoc. The Noble's Estoc shares an R2 with the Estoc that does a slash instead of a thrust, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 3.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Noble's Estoc is an extremely difficult weapon to acquire, and it can take hours to farm one. Personally, I don't think it's worth it either, considering the Estoc does more damage and shares the same moveset, and is only just shorter. If you insist on using this weapon, you won't be min-maxing your build, and will simply be using it for style, which is 100% acceptable. Much like other thrusting swords, it excels with Fire, Lightning, and Sacred Flame Art infusions, so those are all good choices for this weapon. Focus on repeated attack build alone or with another thrusting sword, since the Noble's Estoc deals the second lowest critical attack damage of any thrusting sword, behind the Frozen Needle, making it a poor choice for critical focused builds. Next we have the Cleanrot Knight Sword. The Cleanrot Knight Sword shares the default moveset of most thrusting swords and deals physical damage. It has a heavy weight for a thrusting sword in Elden Ring weighing 4, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Cleanrot Knight Sword has the highest attack rating with elemental infusions and has particularly good heavy scaling, making it an excellent choice for a strength-focused build. It is also the longest thrusting weapon, making it a hard weapon to ignore if you're making a thrusting sword build. It doesn't have a sweeping R2 attack like the Estoc, however, meaning it can have some difficulty against pierce-resistant enemies if you're not using elemental infusions or bleed. I'd recommend using this weapon with either the fire or heavy infusions to take advantage of its high damage, and also use a great shield for solid guard boost while you attack from behind the shield or do block counters. No other thrusting weapon is as effective at this playstyle, and additionally you can add the parry Ash of War to the Cleanrot's Knight Sword, so you can block parry with a great shield out. Next we come to Rogier's Rapier. Rogier's Rapier has a unique R2 that hits 2 times very quickly and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a thrusting sword in Elden Ring weighing 3.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. Rogier's Rapier is arguably the best all-around thrusting sword in Elden Ring, having higher attack rating than most other thrusting swords, being in the middle of pack in terms of thrusting sword reach, and also having a higher critical attack than all other thrusting swords besides the Rapier itself. It also has a unique R2 that hits twice, which does less damage than 2 R1 attacks, but fires off much more quickly, making it ideal for status effect builds that rely on quick attacks. Not to mention, it comes with one of the best Ashes of War in the game in Glintblade Phalanx that can stagger enemies instantly. Because of the unique R2 and relatively good critical attack, I'd advise using this weapon in some sort of duelist build that uses a single thrusting sword, while also either parrying or using Glintblade Phalanx for easy stance breaks. Or use it with the Blood Infusion or Occult with Seppuku for massive bleed potential, like I did in my Crimson Duelist build. And lastly, we come to the Antspur Rapier. The Antspur Rapier shares the default moveset of most thrusting swords and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a thrusting sword in Elden Ring weighing 3, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The Antspur Rapier's claim to fame is that it's the only weapon in Elden Ring that can apply Scarlet Rot, Poison, and Bleed buildup all in the same strike if Seppuku is used and the Poison affinity is selected. It's also one of just a couple Scarlet Rot weapons that can be infused with Ashes of War, making it a great choice for anyone who enjoys applying this status effect. Beyond this, though, the Antspur Rapier is in the middle of the pack when it comes to overall attack rating, and it has the lowest bleed and poison attack rating of all rapiers, so you'll be trading quite a bit of outright damage for these status effects if you choose to go that route. It's also one of the shortest rapiers in Elden Ring, being only just slightly longer than the Rapier and Frozen Needle, so there is also that to consider. However, you could just as easily go something like Occult with Seppuku and forego the poison status effect, simply making use of Scarlet Rot on tougher to kill enemies and bosses, especially ones that are bleed immune. This would give you much higher attack rating and also provide you with a solution to a problem you will face from time to time. Dual wielding this weapon is another good option since it allows you to strike with it repeatedly if it's in the right hand, and also allows you to use a thrusting sword with higher attack rating in the left. This can also help you set status effects even faster depending on how your offhand is set. Make sure to use the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation and Mushroom Crown when using this weapon for even higher attack power, assuming you aren't using bleeding on it. If so, then make sure to add the Lord of Blood's Exaltation and swap out Mushroom Crown for White Mask. Well, that wraps up our video on thrusting swords. What do you guys think of this weapon class? Am I crazy, or is it actually the best weapon class in the game? Let us know in the comments below.